Hey everyone. Tonight we begin in the ruins of a city where the air stinks of smoke and the streets are carpeted with brick dust and broken glass. It's late summer, 1941, and the sun beats down on bloated horses, unburied soldiers, and water that tastes of rust and gasoline. You've heard of Kiev, a proud city, a jewel of Ukraine, but the real first battle of Kiev. It was a trap closing like an iron lid, where orders mattered more than lives, and death could come from the Germans ahead or your own officers behind. This isn't just another chapter in the Eastern Front. It's survival measured in swallows of filthy water, in days without food, in nights when tank tracks rumble closer through the dark. If uncovering history's rawest truths helps you unwind, please like and subscribe. Now dim the lights, lean in close, and march with me into the circle that no one was meant to leave. You are there, in the quiet hush before the storm. It is the faintest blush of dawn, the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. You are fumbling with the last button on your tunic, the fabric cool against your skin, the routine a small comfort in the vastness of the morning. Perhaps you are thinking of a hot cup of tea, or the familiar scent of your mother's kitchen, a memory drifting just out of reach. The air is still, carrying only the faint, distant sounds of the camp beginning to stir. A bird chirps somewhere, a gentle, hopeful note in the burgeoning light. Then, without warning, without a whisper of a prelude, the world simply explodes. The blast is not just a sound. It is a physical force that seizes you, rips you from the ground, and hurls you, a helpless rag doll, against the nearest wall. The impact steals your breath, knocking the wind from your lungs in a ragged gasp. You land hard, disoriented, the world spinning in a dizzying kaleidoscope of dust and pain. For a moment, there is only white noise, a ringing in your ears that obliterates all other sensation. Your vision blurs, the shapes around you losing their definition, becoming indistinct shadows in a swirling cloud of grit. As the dust begins its slow descent, settling like a macabre snow, your eyes struggle to focus. The ringing in your ears dulls, replaced by a cacophony that assaults every sense. The man who stood beside you mere seconds ago, a sturdy presence whose quiet snoring had lulled you to sleep just hours before, is simply gone, vanished, replaced by an ugly splatter of brick dust and something darker, more visceral, that you instinctively know is blood. The space he occupied is now just empty air, a gaping wound in the fabric of your mourning. Then comes the scream, not just one, but a chorus, a terrible, descending shriek that tears through the air. It is the sound of Stukas, German dive bombers, plunging from the sky like predatory birds, their engines howling a song of death. The sound reverberates deep within your chest, a low thrumming that shakes your very bones. Mixed with this chilling mechanical shriek is the pungent, metallic stench of burning oil, acrid and suffocating, mingling with the sickeningly sweet, coppery smell of blood. It coats the back of your throat, a taste of ash and iron, and everywhere, a relentless clatter, the sharp crack of splintering wood, the sickening crunch of collapsing stone, the metallic ringing of rubble bouncing off helmets, a grim, random percussion that underscores the chaos. This isn't the orderly, distant war you've heard about in communiques. This is a visceral, all-encompassing maelstrom. Officers are shouting, their voices hoarse and strained, issuing orders that are immediately swallowed by the earth-shattering detonations. The ground beneath you trembles violently with each concussive shockwave. making it impossible to stand steadily, to think clearly. Half the platoon, frozen in a terrible tableau of shock and terror, scrambles blindly for their rifles, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, as if their bodies have forgotten how to obey. The other half, driven by a primal instinct, dives for any semblance of cover, burrowing into the debris like terrified animals, seeking the illusion of safety beneath shattered beams and fractured walls. You find yourself among them, a part of this desperate, collective scramble. Your hands are shaking, your muscles rigid with a fear so profound it feels like a physical ache. In the deafening roar and the choking dust, a single, horrifying thought crystallizes with chilling clarity. It is not a sudden revelation, but a slow, cold dawning, like ice spreading through your veins. The war, this monstrous, insatiable thing, isn't some abstract concept to be discussed on the radio or read about in a newspaper. It isn't coming. It is here. It has arrived. And with a dreadful certainty that settles deep in your gut, you understand that its gaze, its terrible, unblinking focus, is squarely on you. Your life, your very existence, has become a target. This is not the beginning of a battle. It is the instantaneous immersion into a nightmare from which there seems no escape. The morning bleeds into an afternoon of grim, relentless purpose. You are part of a forced march, swept along with the tide of soldiers and supplies, a living river flowing toward an unknown destiny. Trucks rumble past, their engines groaning under heavy loads, spewing clouds of thick, black exhaust that coats your tongue with soot and burns the back of your throat. Horse-drawn carts, piled high with ammunition crates and the wounded, clatter and creak, their wheels churning dust into a choking haze. Each step is a struggle, a deliberate act of will. Your boots, once sturdy, now feel like leaden weights, dragging through the oppressive heat. The air itself is a heavy, suffocating blanket, thick with the metallic tang of diesel and the acrid, unmistakable smell of burning villages. It's a scent that clings to your clothes, seeps into your skin, and settles deep in your memory. The smell of destruction, of lives undone. The world around you is a blur of scorched earth and skeletal trees, stark monuments to what was. You walk mile after weary mile. The Dnieper River line, a distant, almost mythical destination, a promise whispered on the wind. Along the endless ribbon of the road, the human cost is laid bare, a silent testament to the war's voracious appetite. Civilians, their faces etched with a profound and ancient weariness, shuffle past in a ghostly procession. Their eyes are hollowed, vacant, reflecting a despair so deep it seems to have swallowed all light. They clutch their children close, their meager bundles tied tight, their movements slow and heavy, as if carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. You see a woman, her hair tangled and streaked with ash, standing by the roadside, frozen in a tableau of unimaginable grief. In her hands, she cradles not a child, not a precious possession, but a single, scorched loaf of bread, its edges blackened, its form twisted. Her gaze is fixed on some unseen horizon, her mind perhaps lost in the ruins of a home, a life that no longer exists. There are no tears in her eyes, only a profound stillness, a terrible, quiet resignation. As the sun climbs higher, a relentless, merciless orb in the sky, its heat beats down, baking the earth and parching your throat. Your lips are cracked and dry, a constant, irritating reminder of the thirst that gnaws at you from within. Water is scarce, a precious commodity rationed in miserly sips. When you finally find a source, perhaps a makeshift well or a stream that has not yet been tainted, the relief is fleeting. The water is warm, tepid, and carries a faint, oily taste, a phantom hint of gasoline that whispers of contamination. You drink it anyway, the desperate need overriding any apprehension. The landscape itself becomes a morbid still life. Bloated horse carcasses, their bodies swollen and distorted by the heat, lie beside the road, their dark, glazed eyes staring blankly at the sky. They are surrounded by a constant, buzzing cloud of flies, a low, persistent hum that adds to the oppressive atmosphere. The air is thick with their presence, a living shroud around the fallen. In the distance, a dull, rhythmic thumping, like a slow, heavy heartbeat, reverberates through the ground. It is the sound of artillery fire, far away yet distinct, a constant, low growl that never quite fades, a reminder that the furnace you are entering is vast and relentless. No one speaks it aloud. The words hang unsaid in the heavy air, a shared understanding that needs no vocal confirmation. But you feel it, deep in your bones, a chilling certainty that settles upon you with the weight of prophecy. Everyone senses it, the deliberate direction of the march, the systematic herding. You are being moved, step by weary step, toward a place from which there will be no return. It is a quiet dread, a communal fear that binds you to the men around you, a silent acknowledgement of the trap slowly, inexorably, tightening its grip. The very air seems to hum with this unspoken truth, a quiet, mournful lament for the lives being drawn into its inevitable embrace. The days begin to blur into a relentless cycle, each one bringing with it a deeper understanding of the trap you now inhabit. The whispers become more frequent. Then, the grim news. General Kirpanos, your commander, had pleaded for withdrawal, for a strategic retreat to preserve what remained of the army. But his pleas, desperate and logical, were met with an iron wall of command. Stalin's order, absolute and unyielding, echoed down the chain hold Kiev at all costs. It was a decree that sealed your fate, a pronouncement that transformed you from a soldier into a sacrificial lamb. The psychological vice tightens, clamping down on your spirit with an unrelenting force. You are caught in a grim, impossible dilemma, two formidable enemies, one ahead, one behind. The German forces, relentless and efficient, press forward with a terrifying momentum, their advanced weaponry and disciplined tactics a constant, looming threat. But behind you, unseen yet ever present, are your own officers, the NKVD agents, the enforcers of an unforgiving will. Their methods are brutal, designed not to inspire courage, but to instill a paralyzing fear. One sun-scorched afternoon, by the murky banks of the river, this chilling reality is brought home with stark, brutal clarity. Several soldiers, their faces gaunt with hunger and exhaustion, their uniforms caked with grime, are caught. They were trying to slip away, to find a crack in the tightening net, a chance at life beyond the crushing weight of the lines. There is no trial, no mercy. They are lined up, their shoulders slumped, their eyes fixed on the indifferent water. A volley of shots rings out, sharp and final, shattering the stillness. The sound echoes across the water, a stark demonstration not of justice, but of ruthless control. their bodies fall, silently, into the embrace of the riverbank. A grim lesson for all who witness it. A chill, colder than any autumn wind, passes through the ranks. You are trapped, truly, between a rock and a hard place, knowing that to advance is to face the guns of the enemy, and to retreat is to face the guns of your own command. Daily reality becomes a relentless grind of dust and sweat. By day, you dig. You dig trenches into the unforgiving earth, the sun beating down on your back, the dust caking your throat and clinging to your skin. Each shovelful is an act of exhaustion, a testament to the futility of it all. Your muscles ache, your hands blister, but the digging continues. A desperate, Sisyphean task. The ground is hard, unyielding, as if refusing to give up its secrets. The air vibrates with the distant thud of artillery and the closer crack of rifle fire, a constant reminder of the encroaching threat. As dusk settles, painting the sky in somber hues of orange and gray, the digging ceases, but the vigilance does not. Night brings a new kind of suffering. You stand guard, your body weary, your mind struggling to stay alert. The dew settles on your uniform, seeping into the fabric, chilling you to the bone. The air grows sharp, carrying the damp scent of earth and the faint, sweet smell of decay from the battlefields around you. The darkness, though a temporary reprieve from the relentless sun, brings with it a different kind of dread. In the quiet hours, when the world seems to hold its breath, you can hear it, the low, guttural rumble of tank tracks. They are always closer than they were the night before. A creeping menace, a slow, metallic heartbeat that resonates through the earth and into your chest. It is a sound that fills the silence, pressing in on you, promising destruction with each passing moment. And in these endless days and nights, a grim understanding begins to solidify. This is not simply about defending a city, this proud, ancient jewel. It is something far more profound, far more terrifying. This is about survival, pure and brutal, against orders that seem designed not to achieve victory, but to ensure your demise. You are a pawn, a number in a desperate gamble, and the game is rigged. The truth settles in your heart, a heavy stone that you are fighting not just against the Germans, but against the very command that sent you here, into this inescapable circle of death. The air itself feels heavy with this revelation, a silent lament for the lives being sacrificed. The sky above Kiev becomes a canvas for death, painted in shades of smoke and fire. The German Luftwaffe, an unstoppable force, unleashes a relentless, terrifying assault. Over 1.2 million pounds of bombs fall from the heavens, a biblical rain of steel, tearing into the city and the defensive lines with a deafening fury. Each explosion is a hammer blow, striking the earth with unimaginable force. Dirt and rubble erupt skyward in colossal geysers, clawing at the clouds, momentarily blotting out the sun. The ground beneath your feet ceases to be solid. It shudders, heaves, and trembles with each concussive shockwave. The air is thick, choked with the acrid smell of burnt cordite and pulverized earth. Soot settles everywhere, a fine wuswusa, gritty powder that coats your hair and skin, making you feel dirty inside and out, as if the very dust of death has claimed you. Your ears ring with a constant, high-pitched whine, a phantom echo of the explosions that compress your chest with each near blast. It feels as if an invisible fist is striking you repeatedly, stealing your breath, leaving you gasping. Waves of hot earth, propelled by the force of the detonations, slap against your face, gritty and stinging. Your eyes water, blurred by the dust and the sheer intensity of the assault. You learn to brace yourself, instinctively tensing your muscles with each distant thud, preparing for the violent tremor that follows. Every breath feels heavy, laden with the smell of destruction and the metallic taste of fear. In a brief lull, a deceptive quiet that precedes the next wave of terror, you crouch low beside a wounded comrade. He lies twisted, his breath ragged, a desperate wheezing sound in the oppressive silence. His eyes, wide and unfocused, stare up at the smoke-laden sky. Your heart aches with a dull, familiar throb of helplessness. You fumble for your canteen, its metal warm from your body heat, and carefully, painstakingly, bring it to his cracked lips. A few precious drops trickle out, a lifeline in this parched hell. But then, you see it. A small, dark stain spreading across his tunic, just below his ribs, a ragged hole in his chest, from which the water, your desperate offering of life, simply drips out, merging with the dust and blood on the ground. The futility of the gesture is a fresh wound, a new sorrow. You watch it fall, drop by agonizing drop, powerless to stem the tide of his life draining away. The rivers, once sources of life, have become arteries of death. They are clogged with bodies, bloated and distorted, their forms barely discernible beneath the swirling oil slicks that coat the water's surface. The stench is overwhelming, a sickly sweet odor of decay and petroleum that clings to the air, making every breath a chore. Soldiers, driven to desperation by the relentless thirst, drink from bomb craters, the stagnant, murky water a grim offering from the ravaged earth. It is often polluted, contaminated by the very instruments of war that created these temporary pools. The inevitable consequence follows swiftly. Many men fall sick, their bodies racked with dysentery or diarrhea, a constant, debilitating torment that saps their strength and leaves them even more vulnerable. The sounds of retching and the desperate dashes for cover become grim additions to the battlefield symphony. The wounded lie where they fall, or are moved only short distances, their cries becoming fainter as the hours pass. There are simply not enough stretchers, not enough hands, not enough time. The luxury of proper medical attention is a distant, impossible dream. Many of these brave, suffering souls, abandoned to the elements and the relentless march of infection, succumb to gangrene, their limbs turning black and putrid. The smell of rotting flesh, sickeningly sweet and pervasive, hangs heavy in the air around the makeshift aid stations. If they exist at all, they die, slowly and painfully, their quiet moans swallowed by the roar of battle, their last breaths exhaled into the indifferent, smoke-filled sky. You witness it, the quiet suffering, the desperate flicker of life fading, knowing that it could be you next, left behind. Your own strength draining away with the knowledge that help will never come. The rain of steel is not just a bombardment. It is a relentless, suffocating pressure that crushes both body and spirit. Then came the news, whispered from man to man, passing like a cold current through the ranks, carrying with it the chill of finality. It was not a loud announcement, but a quiet, insidious truth that seeped into your bones. The Germans, moving with ruthless efficiency, had met at Lokwitza, from the north, from the south, Their pincers had closed. The ring, this terrible, suffocating circle you had been marching into, was now sealed. It was an iron hatch slammed shut, trapping you inside, irrevocably cut off from the world beyond. The realization hits you with the force of a physical blow. There will be no resupply, no fresh ammunition, no medical aid, no reinforcements, and, most terrifyingly, no escape. The immediate consequences are brutal and absolute. Rations, already meager, shrink to an almost invisible fraction. A few hard biscuits, dry and tasteless, shared between men, sometimes lasting for days. The gnawing emptiness in your stomach becomes a constant companion, a hollow ache that never truly fades. You are always hungry, a persistent, dull pain that drains your energy and blurs your thoughts. Every scrap of food, every crumb, is savored, stretched, a desperate act of defiance against the encroaching starvation. Ammunition becomes a currency more precious than gold. Each round is counted, meticulously, reverently. Machine guns, once chattering instruments of destruction, are held silent, their muzzles pointed but unyielding. They are only to speak when the enemy is almost upon you, when their faces are visible, when every single bullet can find its mark. The silence is broken only by the sharp, desperate crack of a single rifle, or a brief, controlled burst, a stark contrast to the earlier, wasteful barrages. This enforced quiet, born of scarcity, adds a new layer of tension, a desperate gamble with life and death. The air itself feels thin, stretched taut with anticipation and the weight of what is to come. You remember him, a quiet man, his face etched with the same hunger that plagues you all. You watch as he takes his belt, once a symbol of order and readiness, and with trembling hands, shaves slivers from the hardened leather. It's a desperate, almost ritualistic act. He adds them to his dented mess tin, along with what little water remains, and boils it over a meager, flickering flame. The smell, a strange, leathery odor, fills the small, sheltered space. You watch him sip the bitter broth, his face contorted with the taste, but his eyes holding a glimmer of triumph, a small victory against the relentless gnawing in his stomach. It's a moment of profound despair, and yet a testament to the stubborn will to survive. Disease, an invisible enemy, sweeps through the trapped ranks with chilling efficiency. Bodies weakened by starvation and dehydration become easy prey. Wounds, once minor, fester and rot in the damp, unsanitary conditions. The air is thick with the sweet, sickening smell of infection, a constant reminder of the body's fragility. Some men, driven by the sheer desperation to cling to life, resort to unimaginable acts. You see them, their faces pale and drawn, taking out their pocket knives, their hands shaking, and cutting away the dead, gangrenous flesh themselves. There are no anesthetics, no proper instruments, only a raw, agonizing determination. The sounds of their muffled cries, quickly stifled, are terrible to behold, a stark illustration of the depths to which survival can drive a man. The trap has truly closed, and its embrace is one of slow, agonizing attrition. As the days stretch into a grim eternity, the city of Kiev itself begins to gasp for breath, its proud heart slowly suffocating. The war, a monstrous parasite, has drained it of its very lifeblood. Food supplies dwindle to nothing, then vanish entirely. The once bustling markets are empty, hollowed shells, Water, once plentiful, becomes a precious, guarded commodity, fouled and scarce. Medicine, the last bastion against suffering, is a forgotten luxury. Civilians, their faces gaunt with hunger and fear, wander the streets like ghosts, their cries for help often unheard amidst the din of battle. Soldiers and citizens, bound together by the shared torment, share sips of the same filthy, contaminated water. Their thirst and unyielding torment. Corpses, grim reminders of the war's voracious appetite, lie in the streets, unburied, their forms slowly surrendering to the elements. Flies, a constant, buzzing accompaniment, swarm in rhythmic harmony with the distant artillery fire, a macabre soundtrack to the city's demise. The smell of death, a sickly sweet and cloying odor, hangs heavy in the air, a pervasive scent that never truly fades, clinging to your clothes and haunting your dreams. It is a constant, tangible reminder of the vast, senseless loss that surrounds you. Then, a sudden, jarring break in the mournful rhythm of artillery and flies. A hidden Soviet ammo dump, a vast store of destruction, is struck by a stray German shell. The explosion is not just a sound, it is a primal roar that tears through the fabric of reality. The earth trembles violently, throwing you off balance. A blinding flash erupts, momentarily turning night into an impossible day. The force of the blast levels half a city block in an instant, buildings reduced to dust and splintered wood, their forms dissolving into a chaotic vortex. Dozens of lives are snuffed out without a whisper, reduced to ash and vapor in the blink of an eye. The night sky ignites, painted in hues of orange and red. A terrible, beautiful inferno that casts long, dancing shadows across the devastated landscape. The heat is palpable, a searing wave that washes over you, even at a distance. In the moments that follow, a new, agonizing layer is added to the soundtrack of death. The sharp crack of rifles, closer now, mixes with the desperate, piercing cries of children. It is a sound that cuts through the noise of war, piercing your heart with a cold, sharp pain. The innocent voices, filled with terror and confusion, are a stark contrast to the metallic clang of battle, a reminder of the vulnerable lives caught in this horrific maelstrom. The soldiers, stripped of all conventional sustenance, resort to eating anything they can find, driven by the relentless, gnawing beast of hunger. Wild weeds, bitter and stringy, are plucked from the cracks in the pavement, boiled into a desperate, unpalatable gruel. The leather of belts, already gnawed and boiled before, is again subjected to fire, yielding a tough, bitter broth that offers little nourishment, but briefly quiets the agonizing emptiness in the stomach. Thin soup, made from withered, forgotten beets, their sweetness long gone, provides a fleeting warmth, a deceptive illusion of sustenance. Each mouthful is a grim communion with survival, a desperate act of a dying man clinging to the last vestiges of life. The city, and all within it, truly gasp for breath, each moment a struggle, each heartbeat a defiance. The air, thick with the smell of smoke and despair, suddenly takes on a different quality. It is September 19th, a day that will forever be etched into the ruins of this city and the memories of those trapped within its embrace. The silence that precedes it is unnerving, a held breath before a terrible exhalation. Then, the rumble begins, faint at first, then growing into a deep, guttural roar that vibrates through the earth and the very stone of the buildings. It is the sound of an inevitable tide. German tanks, their steel behemoths clanking and grinding, roll into the central square. Their imposing forms cast long, predatory shadows in the morning light. Flags, bearing the stark, unmistakable emblem of the swastika, snap crisply in the wind, a chilling banner of conquest. Their presence is absolute, undeniable. The long siege, the relentless bombardment, the agonizing wait, it has all culminated in this moment. The enemy is not just at the gates, they are within the heart of the city. Their iron will asserting itself over the shattered landscape. But the city, even in its dying throes, harbors a final, desperate resistance. As the German soldiers pour into the streets, their shouts of victory echoing through the ruins, the ground beneath them erupts. Hidden NKVD time bombs, planted with grim foresight, detonate with concussive force, tearing through the air and shattering the fragile calm. Hundreds of German soldiers, caught unaware, are killed instantly, their bodies flung into the air like rag dolls. The explosions are sharp, violent, a final yet defiant gasp of Soviet resistance. The retaliation is swift, brutal, and utterly without mercy. The German response is a swift, chilling demonstration of their power. Mass shootings begin almost immediately, carried out with cold, efficient precision. Any suspected resistance, any hint of dissent, is met with a bullet. Mass arrests follow. Civilians and remaining soldiers alike rounded up, their faces etched with a dawning terror. The cries of the condemned mingle with the shouts of their captors, a horrifying symphony of conquest and despair. You are there, hiding in a cellar, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and the lingering scent of smoke seeping through the cracked floorboards. Every creak of the floorboards above, every muffled shout, every distant gunshot sends a jolt of ice through your veins. You press yourself against the cold stone, willing yourself to be invisible, to disappear into the very fabric of the earth. You can hear the heavy, measured tread of German boots, their rhythmic crunch above your head, passing back and forth, a constant, menacing presence. Each step feels like it echoes directly in your chest, threatening to give away your fragile sanctuary. The smoke, acrid and bitter, curls through the cracks, burning your eyes, reminding you that the world above is a furnace, and you are hidden beneath its cruel, burning breath. The silence, when it comes, is almost more terrifying than the noise. Pregnant with unseen threats, filled with the dread of discovery. As darkness descends, cloaking the ravaged city in its merciful veil, a new kind of desperate hope flickers in the hearts of the trapped. Small groups, driven by a primal urge to survive, begin to stir. They are no longer soldiers in formation, but gaunt, spectral figures, their faces grim, their movements furtive, their goal to slip away from the tightening German net, to find a path through the impossible. The escape is not through open roads, but through the treacherous, freezing marshes that border the city, a landscape of mud, reeds, and hidden dangers. You are among them, each step a struggle against the sucking mud, the cold water rising to your knees, then your waist. The biting chill seeps into your bones, a constant torment that makes your muscles ache and your teeth chatter. The rustle of reeds, the splash of water. These are the only sounds, amplified in the oppressive silence of the night. Each one a potential betrayer, Suddenly, without warning, the darkness is shattered. Flares arc into the sky, hissing and spitting, turning the fields below into an eerie, blinding white. In that stark, unforgiving light, you are exposed, vulnerable, a solitary figure caught in a spotlight of death. Your heart pounds against your ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. And then, the machine guns open fire. Their harsh, mechanical chatter rips through the darkness, a horrifying sound that seems to come from everywhere at once. Tracers, like fiery darts, zip through the air, their paths illuminated, cutting through the night, seeking out flesh. The marsh, once a potential sanctuary, becomes a killing field. You drop, instinctively, burrowing into the mud, praying that the earth will swallow you whole. The scale of the disaster is truly staggering. Of the 600,000 Red Army troops trapped in the Kiev encirclement, only a small fraction, around 15,000, managed to escape. The rest are captured, their lives transformed into an endless nightmare of captivity. Or they are cut down, their bodies left to sink into the cold, indifferent mud. The marsh holds their secrets, a silent, watery grave for countless souls. In the chaos of one such dash, as you push through the viscous mud, your breath ragged, your vision blurred by exhaustion and fear, your foot lands on something soft, not solid earth, not a hidden rock, but something yielding, something that gives way beneath your weight. A jolt of cold realization shoots through you. It's too late to recoil, too late to prevent the horrible contact. You realize, with a sickening lurch in your stomach, that it is the face of a fallen comrade, half buried in the mud, his features distorted, his eyes staring blankly at the dark sky. The cold, lifeless skin, the subtle give of flesh, the sensation is immediate, visceral, and utterly horrifying. It is a moment that will forever be seared into your memory, a silent, terrible monument to the cost of desperate escape, a phantom touch that lingers long after you stumble onward, away from the horrors of the marsh. For those who survived the immediate horror of the encirclement and the failed breakouts, a new, more insidious nightmare began. You are now part of a vast, despairing tide, one of the countless prisoners of war. The columns stretch for what feels like miles, an endless river of broken men, trudging forward under the watchful, indifferent eyes of German guns. Your hands are bare, stripped of weapons, of dignity. Your bodies are raw with exhaustion, each step a staggering effort. The air itself seems to thicken with the collective despair, a heavy blanket that weighs down every breath. Day after day, the march continues. There is no food, no sustenance, only the relentless, gnawing emptiness in your stomach that never ceases. Water is a distant memory, a tormenting phantom. Your throat is raw, your lips cracked and bleeding. But there is no relief. Those who stumble, whose strength finally abandons them, are simply left behind, their bodies collapsing into the dust. Sometimes, a shot rings out, swift and final, silencing their suffering. But more often, they are simply abandoned, left to die slowly, alone, beneath the indifferent sky, their fate a grim warning to those who still stand. A chilling selectivity begins to unfold along the march, a ruthless weeding out of those deemed most dangerous or undesirable. Political officers, their identities revealed by informers or documents, are pulled from the lines. Officers, the leaders of the defeated army, are identified. And then, the Jewish soldiers, their faces etched with a profound, ancestral fear. They are separated from the rest, herded to the side of the road, their pleas and protests quickly silenced. Then, without ceremony, without a moment's hesitation, they are executed on the spot, their lives extinguished in a sudden burst of gunfire. The casual brutality of it all, the sheer indifference to human life, is a new kind of horror. A chilling reminder of the enemy's merciless ideology. The march continues, but the ranks thin with a dreadful regularity. Dysentery, a relentless, dehydrating torment, sweeps through the weakened columns, its grip tightening with each passing day. Typhus, spread by the lice that infest every thread of your clothing, claims thousands more, their bodies racked with fever, their minds consumed by delirium, and always the slow, agonizing death of starvation, gnawing away at every muscle, every ounce of strength, until bodies become skeletal husks, barely clinging to life. Thousands more die within weeks, their unmarked graves dotting the long, dusty roads of captivity. You are there, a silent observer of this slow, terrible attrition, and a participant in its grim reality. Your own feet are a mass of blisters, raw and bleeding with every step. The pain is a constant, grinding agony. In a moment of desperate bargaining, you make a trade, a quiet exchange that speaks volumes of the depths to which you have sunk. You offer your last spoonful of soup, a precious, life-giving liquid, for a simple rag, a scrap of cloth, anything to wrap your tormented feet, to offer a fleeting moment of relief from the grinding pain. It is a small act, but it encapsulates the brutal reality of your existence, where survival is measured in agonizing choices and the smallest comfort is worth a king's ransom. The numbers, when eventually tallied, speak of a catastrophic, almost unimaginable loss. Over 600,000 Red Army troops, swallowed whole by the jaws of the Kiev encirclement, lost in a matter of weeks. Each number represents a life, a family, a story abruptly ended. But the tragedy did not stop at the battlefield. Tens of thousands of civilians, the innocent bystanders of a brutal war, were also slaughtered, their lives extinguished in the desolate ravine of Babi Yar, a name that would forever echo with unspeakable horror. It is a scar, deep and indelible, etched into the very soul of the land. For those few who survived, for you, Kiev is not merely a name on a map, or a strategic military defeat to be analyzed in war rooms. It is something far more profound, far more visceral. Kiev is hunger, a constant, gnawing emptiness that etched itself into your very being, teaching you the true meaning of deprivation. Kiev is disease, the memory of weakened bodies, the smell of sickness, the quiet agony of infection, the relentless grip of dysentery and typhus that stole so many lives. Kiev is the countless corpses, the faces of the fallen, unburied and left to the elements, their silent presence a permanent fixture in your mind's eye. And perhaps most chillingly, Kiev is the orders, the brutal, unforgiving commands from your own side. Orders that killed more effectively than enemy bullets, trapping you, sacrificing you, leaving you to the mercy of a merciless fate. It is the understanding that you were disposable, a pawn in a game far larger and colder than you could comprehend. Years later, the shadow of Kiev still lingers. You still keep it, carefully, almost reverently, the dented mess tin. It is a simple, humble piece of metal, but it is the only thing you carried out alive from that hellish circle. A solitary relic of your survival. Its surface is scarred, bearing the marks of battle. The dents and scrapes a silent testament to the horrors it witnessed alongside you. And inside, deep within its corroded curves, it is stained with the rust of time, certainly, but also stained with the rust of memories. Memories that cling to it like a stubborn residue. Memories that you can never truly wash away, no matter how many years pass, no matter how hard you try. They are a part of you now, a quiet hum beneath the surface of your life, the lasting echoes of the circle that no one was meant to leave. Our story begins not with the roar of revolution or the shadow of a dictator, but in a small, unassuming town nestled in the undulating landscapes of Georgia. Picture, if you will, the fading light of the 19th century casting long, soft shadows over Gori. A place where the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons and the ancient struggle for survival. It was a time of pervasive hardship, a silent, relentless pressure that shaped every breath and every dream. The air itself seemed to carry the crisp bite of poverty, a chill that seeped into the very bones, particularly during the long, unforgiving winters. The modest homes, often built of rough stone and timber, huddled together, offering scant refuge from the pervasive cold, a cold that promised neither warmth nor comfort. Life in Gori was a tapestry woven with threads of quiet endurance and constant toil. The families who resided there knew intimately the gnawing ache of hunger, the daily calculation of dwindling resources, and the subtle, yet ever-present, fear of illness or destitution. The winding, unpaved streets, often muddy or dusty depending on the weather, bore witness to the quiet procession of lives lived on the very edge of subsistence. The scent of wood smoke, mingling with the earthy aroma of damp soil and the occasional, faint scent of baking bread, was a constant companion, a reminder of both the simple comforts and the constant effort required to sustain them. For the children of Gori, childhood was not a time of carefree play, but an early introduction to the stark realities of their world. A world where every scrap of food, every threadbare garment, was a precious commodity. It was into this challenging environment, this crucible of hardship, that a small boy named Yosef Bessarionis Dzhugashvili, who would later be known to the world as Joseph Stalin, was born. His early years were marked by the fragility inherent in a life of want. He was, by all accounts, a frail child, often sickly, and susceptible to the diseases that preyed upon the impoverished with such devastating efficiency. The air, thin and cold, seemed to carry not just the scent of the mountains, but also the invisible threads of vulnerability. His parents, like so many in Gori, wrestled with their own silent battles against a life that offered little respite. His father, a cobbler, struggled to earn enough to keep his family clothed and fed. His hands calloused from endless labor, his spirit often burdened by the weight of their circumstances. His mother, a woman of deep faith and quiet determination, poured her hopes and dreams into her only surviving child. She imagined a different path for him, one of reverence and stability, a path that led not to the dusty streets of Gori, but to the hallowed halls of the church. Then, When Yoseb was just 7 years old, a cruel hand of fate intervened, leaving an indelible mark that would forever alter his appearance and, perhaps, subtly shape his perception of the world. He contracted smallpox, a dreaded disease that swept through communities, leaving behind a trail of death and disfigurement. The fever raged through his small body, hot and relentless, pushing him to the very brink. Days and nights blurred into a painful haze, punctuated by the worried whispers of his mother and the chilling silence of his own struggling breath. Though he survived, the disease left a profound physical testament to its passage deep, pitted scars across his face. These marks were not merely cosmetic, they were a constant, visible reminder of his early brush with mortality, a silent witness to a childhood touched by suffering. They etched themselves not only onto his skin, but also, perhaps, into the deeper recesses of his young mind, fostering a quiet resolve, a hardening against the vagaries of a world that seemed determined to inflict pain. Despite the scars, and perhaps even because of them, his mother's dreams for him remained steadfast. She saw not a boy marked by illness, but one destined for a higher calling, a life shielded from the brutal realities of Gori. With immense sacrifice, she managed to secure his entry into the Tiflis Spiritual Seminary, a place of learning and religious instruction in the larger, more cosmopolitan city of Tiflis, now known as Tbilisi. It was a world away from the familiar cobblestones of his childhood, a leap from the raw earthiness of Gori to the disciplined, cloistered environment of theological study. She hoped that within these sacred walls, surrounded by the solemn rituals and the timeless texts of faith, her son would find solace, purpose, and a path to a respectable life, far removed from the cold grip of poverty and the disfiguring touch of disease. This transition marked a crucial turning point, a quiet shift from the rough-hewn existence of his early years to a world of books, ideas, and a burgeoning, forbidden curiosity. The Tiflis Spiritual Seminary, with its high, arched windows and echoing stone corridors, presented a stark contrast to the gritty realities of Gori. Here, silence was not merely the absence of sound, but an intentional presence, a deliberate atmosphere cultivated for contemplation and study. It was a silence punctuated only by the soft rustle of cassocks, the murmuring of prayers, and the gentle turning of heavy book pages. The air within these ancient walls was cool and still, often carrying the faint, comforting scent of old parchment and beeswax candles. Young Yoseb, now immersed in this new world, found himself navigating a strict regimen of religious instruction, theological debate, and the rigorous discipline of seminary life. He was expected to absorb the teachings of the Church, to embrace its traditions, and to prepare himself for a life of spiritual service, a life of quiet devotion. Yet, beneath this veneer of pious tranquility, a different kind of transformation was slowly taking root within him. The very silence that was meant to foster spiritual reflection inadvertently created a fertile ground for forbidden thoughts, for whispered ideas that dared to challenge the established order. It was here, amidst the sacred texts and the solemn liturgies, that Yoseb began to seek out other, more subversive pages. In the hushed hours, perhaps long after his fellow students had retired, or in the concealed corners of the library, he would secretly pore over revolutionary pamphlets and the radical writings of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. These forbidden texts, vibrant with calls for justice, equality, and the overthrow of oppressive systems, offered a stark, exhilarating contrast to the rigid doctrines of the Church. Their words were like sparks in the quiet darkness of his mind, igniting a hunger for knowledge, a different kind of truth. The stark contrast between the seminary's teachings and the revolutionary ideas he devoured created a profound internal dissonance. On one hand, there was the promise of spiritual salvation, the comfort of faith, and the steady path laid out by the Church. On the other, there was the electrifying allure of social revolution, the passionate belief in a world remade, and the raw power inherent in collective struggle. This was not a passive intellectual exercise. It was a deeply personal unfolding. He wrestled with these competing ideologies, weighing the quiet resignation of faith against the fiery activism of rebellion. The more he read, the more he became convinced that the true path to alleviating the suffering he had witnessed in Gori lay not in prayer, but in action. The seminary, ironically, became his intellectual forge, sharpening his mind and solidifying his burgeoning radical convictions. This period marked a quiet, yet profound, metamorphosis. The frail, scarred boy from Gori, once destined for the priesthood, began to shed the skin of his childhood vulnerability. He was no longer simply a victim of circumstances or a passive recipient of doctrine. Instead, he started to perceive himself as an agent of change, a participant in a grand, unfolding drama. The initial seeds of this shift were subtle, almost imperceptible to those around him. Yet they were potent. He started to believe, with an intensifying conviction, that genuine power, the kind that could truly reshape the world and liberate the suffering masses, was not granted through divine grace or inherited privilege. No, he came to understand that such power could only be forged, earned, and ultimately seized through unrelenting struggle. It was a harsh, unyielding lesson learned not from sermons, but from the stark logic of revolutionary thought, a logic that resonated deeply with the experiences of hardship and vulnerability that had marked his early life. The quiet walls of the seminary, intended to guide him towards spiritual enlightenment, instead became the unlikely incubator for a revolutionary spirit, one that would soon break free and embark on a very different, far more tumultuous journey. Having shed the quiet robes of seminary life, Yoseb stepped onto a path far removed from the spiritual serenity his mother had envisioned. This new road, however, was neither clear nor straight. It was a winding, often brutal passage defined by clandestine meetings, whispered plots, and the ever-present threat of czarist repression. He plunged headlong into the burgeoning revolutionary movement, a world simmering with discontent and ablaze with fervent idealism. His early forays were characterized by a fierce energy and a shrewd organizational mind. He became a key figure in orchestrating strikes among the oil workers in Baku, a city then pulsating with industrial activity, and in mobilizing protests against the autocratic rule of the Tsar. He moved through the underground networks with a quiet intensity, his scarred face a familiar, though often unreadable, presence among fellow revolutionaries. He spoke with a measured conviction, his words carefully chosen, always with an eye toward practical action and tangible results. But the path of revolution in early 20th century Russia was fraught with peril, and Yoseb soon experienced its harsh realities firsthand. His relentless activities inevitably drew the attention of the Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police. His first arrest was not merely an inconvenience. It was a visceral immersion into the brutal machinery of state repression. The cold, damp cells of the czarist prisons, the metallic clang of the heavy doors, the pervasive scent of mildew and despair etched themselves into his memory. He tasted the raw, unyielding brutality of interrogation, the deliberate humiliation, and the chilling silence that preceded punishment. This experience, rather than breaking his spirit, seemed to temper it, hardening his resolve and cementing his belief that the existing power structure was not only corrupt, but inherently violent. It solidified his conviction that only through force, through a willingness to meet brutality with an even greater, more disciplined force, could the revolution succeed. As the years passed, his tactics began to shift, moving away from mere organization and protest towards a more ruthless and uncompromising approach. The idealism of his youth, if it had ever truly existed, was slowly overshadowed by a chilling pragmatism. He became involved in actions that were not merely daring, but outright criminal in the eyes of the law, justified by the revolutionary cause. The infamous 1908 Tiflis bank robbery stands as a stark testament to this evolving ruthlessness. It was a brazen, violent act, meticulously planned and executed with cold precision. The objective was clear: to acquire funds for the Bolshevik Party's activities, to fuel the engine of revolution with stolen rubles. The cacophony of the explosion, the shouts, the panic, the deadly exchange of gunfire, these were the sounds that marked this drastic escalation. The heist, which successfully netted a staggering 250,000 rubles, an immense sum for the time, was not just about money. It was a deliberate act of defiance, a statement of intent, a violent assertion of power against the state. It was around this time, as his reputation for cunning and brutality grew within revolutionary circles, that Yoseb Djugashvili shed his birth name and adopted a new one, Stalin. This moniker, meaning man of steel in Russian, was more than just an alias. It was a carefully chosen symbol, both an oath to himself and a mask to the world. It conveyed an image of unyielding strength, an impenetrable will, and an unwavering resolve. It was a declaration of his identity as a hardened revolutionary, someone who would not bend, would not break, and would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. The choice of this name marked a profound internal crystallization. From that moment forward, the core motivation driving his actions subtly, yet irrevocably, shifted. The early revolutionary fervor, perhaps tinged with genuine aspirations for fairness and the betterment of the common people, began to recede into the background. The ultimate goal was no longer the elusive concept of abstract justice or collective well-being. Instead, it narrowed, focused, and hardened into a singular, all-consuming objective: the acquisition and consolidation of power. Every decision, every tactic, every alliance, and every act of violence would henceforth be meticulously calculated to serve this paramount aim. The man of steel had been forged in the crucible of poverty, illness, and prison. And now, he was prepared to wield his newfound strength with a cold, unforgiving hand, ready to shape the world to his formidable will. The year 1917 dawned upon Russia like a tempest, pregnant with the promise of upheaval and the stark realities of war. The old order, the czarist regime, was crumbling under the weight of its own inertia, the demands of a brutal global conflict, and the simmering discontent of its vast populace. Amidst this rising tide of revolution, Joseph Stalin, the newly christened Man of Steel, found his footing not on the barricades, but in the quiet, yet immensely powerful, realm of communication. During the tumultuous period of the 1917 revolution, his role was pivotal, though often unseen by the masses. He managed Pravda, the official newspaper of the Bolshevik Party. This was not merely a journalistic endeavor. It was a strategic weapon. Through its pages, Stalin helped to shape the narrative, to articulate the party's agenda, and to rally the disillusioned and the hopeful alike. Every headline, every editorial, every carefully chosen word was a brick laid in the foundation of the burgeoning revolutionary state, laying the groundwork for the Bolshevik ascendancy. He understood, instinctively, the power of words, of controlling the flow of information, even in the midst of chaos. As the October Revolution swept through the imperial capital, seizing power in Petrograd, the initial burst of revolutionary fervor soon gave way to the grim realities of civil war. The vast Russian Empire fractured into warring factions, plunging the nation into a brutal, fratricidal conflict. The Reds, the Bolsheviks, and their allies clashed violently with the Whites, a disparate coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces, monarchists, and foreign interventionists. For Stalin, this was a moment of clear-cut choice, a definitive line drawn in the bloody sand. He stood unequivocally with Vladimir Lenin and the Reds. This was not a passive allegiance. He threw himself into the war effort, not as a frontline commander, but as a political commissar, tasked with ensuring the ideological purity and loyalty of the Red Army. He traveled extensively, often in dangerous conditions, rallying troops, enforcing discipline, and purging any elements perceived as disloyal. His presence was formidable, his decisions often ruthless, leaving little room for dissent or hesitation. The eventual Bolshevik victory in the Civil War, hard-won and bathed in blood, profoundly altered the geopolitical landscape and, more importantly for Stalin, cemented his position within the new power structure. The Red Army emerged triumphant, and with it, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union became the undisputed ruler of the vast new state. Stalin, through his unwavering loyalty, his organizational acumen, and his willingness to make hard, often brutal, decisions, found himself at the very center of this nascent power apparatus. He was no longer a fringe revolutionary, but a vital cog in the machine that was rebuilding Russia into the Soviet Union. The chaos of civil war had allowed him to prove his worth, to demonstrate his strategic mind and his capacity for cold, calculated action. It was in the aftermath of this cataclysmic conflict, as the new Soviet state began to find its footing amidst the rubble of the old, that Stalin began to acquire a chillingly precise and systematic understanding of power dynamics. He observed, he learned, and he meticulously cataloged the vulnerabilities of political rivals and potential adversaries. The lesson of the Civil War was clear. Victory demanded absolute unity and the elimination of all perceived threats. He began to learn how to identify those who might stand in the way, how to isolate them, and, most chillingly, how to eliminate them. This was not about overt violence in the streets, but a far more insidious form of political warfare. The art of bureaucratic maneuver, the subtle accumulation of leverage, the quiet erosion of an opponent's influence, leading ultimately to their systematic removal. The seeds of the future purges were sown in these early years, as Stalin, with a calm, analytical gaze, began to master the intricate and often brutal dance of Soviet power politics, quietly positioning himself for a far greater role. In the spring of 1922, amidst the quiet administrative hum of the new Soviet state, an appointment was made that, at the time, seemed largely innocuous. even dull. Joseph Stalin was appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party. On the surface, it appeared to be a purely bureaucratic role, one concerned with the meticulous minutiae of party organization, managing cadres, appointing regional officials, overseeing internal communications, and shuffling paperwork. It was a position often overlooked by the more charismatic and intellectually vibrant figures within the Bolshevik leadership. Men like Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, or Lev Kamenev, who saw themselves as the true ideological heirs to Lenin and the public faces of the revolution. They were focused on grand policy debates, international socialist movements, and the visible levers of state power. Yet, Stalin, with his characteristic shrewdness and a quiet understanding of how real power was accumulated, saw something profoundly different in this seemingly administrative post. He recognized that the General Secretary controlled the party's nervous system. By overseeing appointments, he could place loyalists in key positions throughout the vast apparatus of the Soviet Union, from the smallest village councils to the highest echelons of government and the military. He could collect information, build dossiers, and establish networks of informants. This seemingly tedious work granted him unprecedented, total control over the party's internal machinery, making him the ultimate gatekeeper and orchestrator behind the scenes. While others debated grand theories, Stalin was quietly weaving a web of influence, tightening his grip, thread by invisible thread. The political landscape changed dramatically with the illness and eventual death of Vladimir Lenin, the revered leader of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1924. His passing left a gaping void at the pinnacle of Soviet power, triggering a ruthless struggle for succession among the leading Bolsheviks. What followed was not an open, democratic contest, but a protracted, often brutal, political chess match. Stalin, from his strategic perch as General Secretary, played the game with unparalleled cunning and patience. He masterfully exploited the rivalries and ideological divisions among his opponents, skillfully forming temporary alliances only to discard them when they no longer served his purpose. His primary target was Leon Trotsky, the brilliant orator, military leader, an intellectual whom many considered Lenin's natural successor. Stalin systematically undermined Trotsky's influence, first isolating him politically, then removing him from key positions, and eventually expelling him from the party and exiling him from the Soviet Union. This process was a slow, agonizing suffocation of a formidable rival. But Trotsky was not the only one. Others, like Zinoviev and Kamenev, who had initially allied with Stalin against Trotsky, also eventually found themselves targeted, their positions eroded, their reputations tarnished, and their voices silenced. The methods were varied, yet consistently effective public denouncements, carefully orchestrated votes, fabricated accusations, and the gradual stripping away of their power bases. By the late 1920s, the outcome of this relentless, calculated campaign was chillingly clear. Stalin had methodically consolidated all power into his own hands. His rivals had been systematically dismantled, either through exile, as in Trotsky's case, through forced confessions and show trials that led to execution, or through sheer political isolation, rendering them utterly impotent. The party, once a forum for fierce debate, was now a monolithic entity, its every breath controlled by the General Secretary. There was no one left, neither within the party nor outside it, who possessed the influence, the courage, or the organizational capacity to challenge his supreme authority. The quiet administrator had, through patient and ruthless machinations, transformed himself into the undisputed master of the Soviet Union. ready to mold the vast nation to his will, without dissent or opposition. The stage was set for a new, terrifying chapter in Soviet history, one forged by the man of steel's absolute, unchallengeable rule. With his power firmly consolidated, Joseph Stalin turned his formidable will towards transforming the sprawling, largely agrarian Soviet Union into a modern industrial powerhouse. The late 1920s saw the launch of the 5-year plans, ambitious and often brutal blueprints for rapid industrialization. These were not mere economic policies. They were grand, almost mythical endeavors, presented to the populace as a collective struggle for a brighter, more powerful future. The nation was called upon to sacrifice, to toil, to build, at an inhuman pace. Factories sprang up across the vast landscape, often in remote, unforgiving locations. Gigantic new dams harnessed the power of rivers. Vast mining operations burrowed deep into the earth, and colossal steel mills belched smoke into the sky. The numbers were staggering. Almost beyond comprehension, production targets for steel, electricity, and coal soared to unprecedented heights. New cities rose from empty steppes, populated by millions of workers, often driven by a mix of idealism and coercion. The air vibrated with the roar of machinery, the clang of hammers, and the ceaseless clamor of construction. From a quantitative perspective, the plans achieved astonishing results. Soviet industry indeed expanded at a phenomenal rate, turning out a torrent of raw materials and heavy machinery that had previously seemed impossible. The world watched, some with admiration, others with horror, as a backward nation seemingly pulled itself into the industrial age by its bootstraps. Yet, this monumental transformation came at an unspeakable cost. A price measured not in rubles or tons of steel, but in human lives, in shattered families, and in the exhaustion of an entire populace. The pace was relentless, the demands impossible to meet without extreme deprivation. Workers, often ill-fed and poorly housed, toiled for grueling hours, 7 days a week, often in hazardous conditions. Safety standards were minimal, if they existed at all, and accidents were commonplace. The concept of Stakhanovite workers, superachievers who exceeded their quotas by incredible margins, was propagated as an ideal, creating immense pressure on everyone else. Those who failed to meet their increasingly impossible quotas, or who were merely perceived as slowing down the pace, faced dire consequences. They were branded as saboteurs, or enemies of the people, subjected to summary trials, and often faced execution, or perhaps even worse, exile to the vast and terrifying network of forced labor camps, the gulags, in the frozen wilderness of Siberia. The dream of industrial might was built upon a foundation of human suffering, a silent scream buried beneath the concrete and steel. Simultaneously, Stalin launched an equally brutal campaign against the rural heart of Russia collectivization. The traditional peasant way of life, centered around individual farms and small villages, was systematically dismantled. Millions of small landholdings were forcibly merged into vast collective farms, ostensibly to increase agricultural output and feed the growing industrial workforce. But the implementation was merciless. Peasants who resisted, particularly the more prosperous kulaks, were stripped of their land, their livestock, and their homes. They were denounced, exiled, or executed. The forced requisitioning of grain, often leaving the farmers with nothing to feed themselves, triggered catastrophic famines, particularly in Ukraine, the Volga region, and Kazakhstan. Millions perished, not from natural disaster, but from deliberate policy. Fields lay fallow, crops rotted, and the skeletal figures of the starving wandered the countryside, their cries echoing unheard. For Stalin, observing this immense suffering from the Kremlin, the human cost was simply the necessary price. He viewed the millions of lives extinguished by famine and forced labor not as individual tragedies, but as statistical anomalies, unavoidable casualties in the grand march towards a powerful, industrialized future. He believed that the survival and strength of the Soviet state demanded such sacrifices, that the old ways had to be brutally swept aside to make way for the new. The screams of the dying, the silent despair of the collective farm workers, faded into the background as he gazed upon the soaring production figures, convinced that he was forging a new world, no matter the rivers of blood and tears it required. As the Soviet Union was being reshaped by the colossal forces of industrialization and forced collectivization, another, more subtle, yet equally pervasive, transformation was underway. Joseph Stalin, the architect of this new reality, understood profoundly the power of image, of narrative, and of constructing a persona that transcended mere leadership. He meticulously orchestrated the creation of a cult of personality, an omnipresent image that permeated every facet of Soviet life. His portrait, often depicting him with a benevolent, paternal gaze, or with the stern, resolute look of a visionary leader, began to appear everywhere. From the smallest village schools to the largest industrial factories, from bustling public squares to the intimate spaces of private homes, his face was ubiquitous, an inescapable presence. He became the father of the nation, the great leader, the brilliant strategist, and the son of the revolution. Every medium available was harnessed to propagate this carefully constructed image. Newspapers, once conduits for diverse revolutionary voices, now carried only glowing tributes and reverent pronouncements. Every article, regardless of its original topic, seemed to find a way to praise his wisdom, his foresight, and his unwavering dedication. Songs, composed by government-approved artists, filled the airwaves with anthems of devotion to him. Posters, vibrant with heroic depictions of workers and soldiers, invariably featured his towering figure, guiding the nation towards a glorious future. His speeches, carefully edited and endlessly replayed, became the gospel, the unquestionable truth. History itself was rewritten to elevate his role, to erase inconvenient facts, and to demonize his former rivals, presenting a flawless, almost divine, trajectory from humble revolutionary to unparalleled leader. The air was thick with adulation, a constant, manufactured chorus of praise that left little room for independent thought or critical analysis. Yet, beneath this meticulously crafted veneer of benevolent paternalism and universal adoration, a deeper, far more insidious current flowed within Stalin, profound and escalating paranoia. The very adulation he demanded seemed to fuel his suspicion. He saw threats everywhere, in every whispered conversation, every ambiguous remark, every momentary flicker of independent thought. He became convinced that plots were constantly being hatched against him, that hidden enemies lurked in every shadow, that even his closest confidants harbored secret desires to usurp his power. This paranoia was not merely a personal eccentricity. It became a defining characteristic of his rule, shaping policy and dictating the fates of millions. The constant reinforcement of his own superiority, the systematic eradication of any challenge to his authority, led to a chilling logic. No one, absolutely no one, was permitted to appear superior to him in any field. not in military strategy, not in ideological purity, not in intellectual prowess, and certainly not in popularity. Any individual who garnered too much independent renown, or whose loyalty was perceived to be less than absolute, immediately became a target. Dissent, even the mildest disagreement, was reinterpreted as treason, as a direct threat to the stability of the state and to the infallible leader himself. The very notion of individual distinction became dangerous, as it might, in Stalin's fevered mind, diminish his own singular brilliance. This increasingly pathological suspicion, coupled with his absolute power and the cult of personality that legitimized his every decision, set the stage for an unparalleled era of terror. The ground was meticulously prepared for the purges, a systematic, widespread campaign of arrests, torture, and executions that would engulf the entire Soviet Union. The pervasive praise and the suffocating silence of fear intertwined, creating an atmosphere where trust was a luxury and suspicion was a survival instinct. Every citizen, from the highest-ranking official to the humblest peasant, was now potentially under the gaze of an all-seeing, all-suspicious leader, whose image was everywhere, and whose paranoia knew no bounds. The stage was tragically set for the ensuing nightmare, a period of terror that would leave an indelible scar on the soul of a nation. The year 1934 marked a chilling turning point, a quiet yet profound deepening of the shadow that had begun to stretch across the Soviet Union. Sergei Kirov, a popular and charismatic party leader, was assassinated. While official reports blamed enemies of the people, it is now widely believed, and indeed confirmed by historical research, that his murder was orchestrated on Stalin's direct orders. Kirov had gained considerable popularity, perhaps too much, and was seen by some as a potential alternative to Stalin's increasingly autocratic rule. His death served as a convenient pretext, a manufactured crisis that provided Stalin with the ultimate justification for a brutal crackdown against perceived opposition. It was the spark that ignited the inferno of what would come to be known as the Great Purge. The late 1930s witnessed a horrific escalation of state terror, a period of systematic elimination that reached into every corner of Soviet society. The scale was unprecedented, the methods chillingly efficient. Hundreds of thousands of party members, military officers, intellectuals, artists, and ordinary citizens were arrested under the flimsiest of pretexts. The infamous knock on the door in the dead of night became a terrifying symbol of an arbitrary, all-consuming power. Once apprehended, they were subjected to brutal interrogations, psychological torture, and physical abuse, often in the grim cellars of the NKVD, the secret police. The objective was not justice, but confession to fantastic crimes, to treason, to sabotage, to conspiracy, often implicating others in a cascading web of false accusations. The show trials that followed were macabre theatrical productions, designed to demonstrate the state's power and to propagate a narrative of constant internal threat. Prominent old Bolsheviks, companions of Lenin who had helped forge the revolution, were paraded before the world, forced to confess to absurd crimes, their faces hollow, their spirits broken. Their public humiliation and subsequent execution sent an unmistakable message to anyone who might harbor even a fleeting thought of dissent. The terror, however, was not confined to the party elite. It reached deep into the military, devastating its leadership. A staggering 81 of the 103 generals and admirals in the Red Army were executed, along with tens of thousands of other officers. This systematic decapitation of the military command, motivated by Stalin's profound distrust and fear of any potential rival power base, left the Soviet armed forces crippled, severely weakening them on the eve of a global conflict. The sheer human toll of the Great Purge is almost impossible to grasp. Estimates vary, but it is believed that around 20 million people were either sent to the infamous Gulag labor camps or summarily executed. The Gulags, vast networks of forced labor camps stretching across the frozen taiga and desolate steppes, became centers of unimaginable suffering, where starvation, exhaustion, and disease claimed millions more lives. Entire populations were deported, families shattered, and communities obliterated. The fear was palpable, a suffocating blanket that descended upon the entire nation. People learned to live in silence, to speak only in whispers, to trust no one, not even their closest friends or family, lest a careless word lead to denunciation and the inevitable, terrifying disappearance. The Soviet Union became a nation living under the crushing weight of omnipresent fear. The vibrant revolutionary spirit that had once promised liberation had been replaced by a pervasive dread. Every individual became a potential suspect, every action scrutinized, every thought potentially treacherous. The man of steel had forged a society not of iron, but of glass, brittle and transparent, where every citizen existed under the constant, unblinking eye of a paranoid state. The terror, born from Stalin's deepening suspicion, achieved its grim objective: absolute, unchallenged control. It left the country deeply scarred, its collective memory haunted by the specter of the vanished, the silenced, and the countless lives consumed by the relentless machinery of the purge. And yet, this brutal consolidation of power, born of fear, ironically positioned the Soviet Union for the greatest test it would ever face. As the 1930s drew to a close, a new storm gathered on the horizon, threatening to engulf the world in a conflict of unprecedented scale. In August 1939, Joseph Stalin, the man of steel, made a shocking strategic move, signing a non-aggression pact with Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. This agreement, seemingly an alliance of convenience between two ideologically opposed dictatorships, sent shockwaves across the globe. For Stalin, it bought time, allowing him to continue industrializing and, he hoped, to delay the inevitable clash. The ink was barely dry on the pact. However, when Germany invaded Poland, igniting World War II, for nearly 2 years, the Soviet Union watched from the sidelines, absorbing territories from its Western neighbors, while Hitler swept across Western Europe. But the truce was always destined to be temporary. A fragile illusion shattered in the early morning hours of June 22, 1941, without warning. Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive, unprovoked invasion of the Soviet Union. The sheer scale of the assault was staggering. A mechanized wave of destruction that crashed across the Soviet borders, catching the Red Army woefully unprepared. The consequences of Stalin's earlier purges immediately became painfully apparent. The systematic execution of hundreds of thousands of experienced military officers in the late 1930s had left the Red Army gravely weakened, devoid of much of its command structure and strategic depth. Initial Soviet resistance was chaotic, marked by devastating losses in men and material. Millions of soldiers were captured or killed, and vast swaths of Soviet territory fell rapidly under German occupation. The future of the Soviet Union, and indeed of the world, hung precariously in the balance. As the German war machine advanced relentlessly eastward, reaching the very gates of Moscow and then turning south towards the vital oil fields of the Caucasus, Stalin found himself facing the ultimate test of his leadership. In the dark days of 1942, with the Germans pushing toward Stalingrad, a city that bore his very name, he issued his most famous and most ruthless order: not one step back. This directive was absolute, a desperate demand for unyielding resistance at any cost. Any soldier attempting to retreat without orders, any officer failing to hold their ground, faced immediate execution by their own comrades. The battle for Stalingrad became an apocalyptic struggle, a grinding, brutal urban warfare fought building by building, room by room, under an unending hail of fire. The city was reduced to rubble, a landscape of broken concrete and twisted metal. Yet the Soviet defenders, fueled by desperation, patriotism, and the absolute terror of Stalin's order, fought with an unyielding ferocity. The winter of 1942 to 1943 proved to be the turning point. After months of unimaginable suffering and sacrifice, the Red Army, under the most brutal conditions, encircled and ultimately destroyed the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. It was a victory forged in blood and ice, a colossal triumph achieved at an immense human cost. This decisive Soviet victory, the largest and bloodiest battle in human history, marked the beginning of the end for the German war effort on the Eastern Front. It was a strategic and psychological turning point, shifting the momentum of the war irrevocably against the Axis powers. For Stalin, the victory at Stalingrad was more than just a military success. It was a profound vindication. Despite the earlier purges and the initial disasters, the Red Army, under his ultimate command, had not only held the line but had decisively crushed the seemingly invincible Nazi war machine in the eyes of the world, and more importantly, in the eyes of his own people. Stalin emerged from the crucible of Stalingrad, transformed into a wartime symbol, a figure of heroic resistance and unwavering resolve. His image, once stained by the purges and the famine, was now reforged in the fires of war, burnished by the sacrifice of millions and the monumental achievement of defeating Nazi Germany. He was seen not just as a dictator, but as the supreme commander who had saved the Soviet Union, the formidable leader who had led his nation through its darkest hour to ultimate victory. The silent suffering of the preceding years was overshadowed by the roar of cannons and the triumph over fascism. This victory would cast a long shadow, shaping not only the post-war world, but also cementing Stalin's formidable, almost mythical, place in the annals of history, preparing the ground for a new kind of global struggle. The triumph of 1945, hard-won and bathed in the blood of millions, brought an end to the brutal global conflict, but it ushered in a new, chilling era of geopolitical tension. As the dust settled and the map of Europe was redrawn, the Soviet Union, under Stalin's iron grip, wasted no time in asserting its newfound power and expanding its sphere of influence. Across Eastern Europe, where the Red Army had liberated nations from Nazi occupation, Soviet influence hardened into an inescapable reality. Countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany quickly became satellite states, nominally independent, but effectively controlled by Moscow. Their political systems were remade in the Soviet image, their economies tied to Moscow's will, and their populations subjected to new forms of political repression. An iron curtain, as Winston Churchill famously described it, descended across the continent, dividing Europe into two ideologically opposed blocs. This post-war consolidation of power was profoundly shaped by Stalin's deep-seated suspicion, a paranoia that had only intensified during the war and its aftermath. He had keenly observed the United States' use of the atomic bomb on Japan in August 1945. The devastating power unleashed upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki filled him with a potent mixture of awe and profound betrayal. Despite being allies during the war, Stalin felt that the USSR had deliberately kept the atomic weapon a secret from him, using it not just to defeat Japan, but also to intimidate the Soviet Union, to assert American global dominance. This perceived deception fueled his long-held belief that the capitalist West was an inherent and existential threat, always seeking to undermine the socialist experiment. The quiet unease between the wartime allies began to calcify into open distrust. This hardening suspicion of the West became the bedrock upon which the Cold War was built. The ideological chasm between communism and capitalism widened into an unbridgeable gulf, marked by an arms race, proxy wars, and a relentless propaganda battle. Every action by one side was interpreted as a hostile maneuver by the other. The race for nuclear weapons accelerated, plunging the world into an era of existential dread, where the possibility of global annihilation loomed large. Stalin saw the world as a zero-sum game, where the triumph of one ideology necessarily meant the defeat of the other. There could be no true coexistence, only a relentless struggle for global supremacy. The tangible manifestation of this growing ideological divide became particularly acute in the heart of Europe. Berlin, a city physically divided by the war, became a microcosm of the global struggle. Eastern Berlin, under Soviet control, and Eastern Europe as a whole, transformed into formidable ideological barricades, a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the capitalist West. Strict border controls, vast military deployments, and pervasive political censorship ensured that ideas, people, and goods flowed only in directions approved by Moscow. The physical division of the city, and indeed the continent, mirrored the profound philosophical and political schism that defined the Cold War. These were not just geographical boundaries. They were battle lines drawn in a war of ideas, a silent, yet intense, struggle for the future of humanity. Stalin, the man of steel, had survived the greatest military conflict in history only to plunge the world into a new, prolonged era of tension and fear. His paranoia now shaping not just the fate of his own nation, but the very destiny of the planet. The seeds of global anxiety were sown, nurtured by the lingering shadow of a man who saw threats lurking in every corner. As the 1950s dawned, a subtle yet perceptible shift began to take hold within the formidable figure of Joseph Stalin, the man of steel who had ruled with an iron fist for decades, guiding his nation through cataclysmic war and reshaping the global order, was finally showing signs of his mortality. His health, though carefully concealed from the public, was in steady decline. The relentless pressures of absolute power, the constant vigilance against real and imagined enemies, and the sheer weight of his brutal decisions had taken their toll. The precise details of his ailments were shrouded in secrecy, but it was clear that his body was beginning to betray the indomitable will that had driven him for so long. His public appearances became less frequent, his movements slower, his gaze perhaps a little less piercing. Yet, even as his physical strength waned, his signature trait, his profound and pervasive paranoia, only intensified. The successful conclusion of the war and the establishment of the Soviet bloc had not brought him peace. Instead, he saw new threats emerging from within his own inner circle, from the very people who had served him with unwavering loyalty for years. He became increasingly isolated, trusting fewer and fewer individuals, convinced that plots against him were brewing in the shadows of the Kremlin. The very success he had achieved seemed to fuel a deeper suspicion that others might now seek to take what he had built. In this atmosphere of heightened suspicion, Stalin began to prepare for what would have been yet another devastating purge, one aimed at the highest ranks of the Communist Party. Whispers of a doctor's plot, an alleged conspiracy by prominent Jewish doctors to assassinate Soviet leaders, began to circulate, a chilling echo of the earlier purges. This new campaign was designed to cleanse the party of any remaining elements of perceived disloyalty, to solidify his legacy, and to ensure that his absolute control would extend even beyond his lifetime. The chilling machinery of the secret police was once again being set in motion, compiling lists, fabricating evidence, and preparing for a new wave of arrests, show trials, and executions. The scent of fear, which had momentarily receded after the war, was beginning to seep back into the corridors of power. However, fate intervened with a sudden and unexpected finality. On March 1, 1953, Stalin suffered a massive stroke. For several agonizing days, he lay incapacitated, reportedly ignored by his terrified inner circle, who were too afraid to enter his room without his permission. Even as he lay dying, the man who had orchestrated the deaths of millions, who had commanded armies and reshaped continents, lay helpless, his power suddenly meaningless. Finally, on March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin, the man of steel, died before the planned purge could begin. His last, terrifying act of political violence thwarted by the unyielding force of mortality. The precise circumstances of his final hours remain a subject of historical debate, shrouded in the secrecy that had defined his entire reign. The news of his death plunged the Soviet Union into a maelstrom of shock and grief, mixed with an unspoken, collective sense of relief. The funeral, held on March 9th, became a chaotic spectacle, a final, tragic testament to the cult of personality he had so meticulously constructed. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, converged on Moscow to pay their last respects, driven by a complex mix of genuine sorrow, ingrained obedience, and the sheer momentum of decades of propaganda. The crowds were immense, uncontrollable, and desperate to catch a glimpse of the fallen leader. In the crush of the colossal crowd, a horrific stampede ensued, claiming the lives of an estimated 500 people, a final, grim tally added to the countless millions who had perished under his rule. It was a chaotic, violent end to a life defined by order brutally enforced. In the immediate aftermath, a collective leadership took the reins, but it was Nikita Khrushchev who slowly emerged as the dominant figure. With a calculated boldness, Khrushchev initiated a process of de-Stalinization, beginning with his secret speech in 1956, which openly denounced Stalin's crimes and personality cult. Statues were toppled, cities renamed, and the official narrative began to acknowledge, albeit cautiously, the immense suffering caused by his regime. It was a tentative, often contradictory process, but it marked the beginning of the end for an era ruled by absolute fear and a single, all-consuming will. The long, dark shadow of the man of steel began, ever so slowly, to recede, allowing a faint, fragile light of introspection to glimmer over the vast, scarred landscape of the Soviet Union. And perhaps, in that fading light, we can glimpse not just the horrors of the past, but the enduring human spirit that seeks solace and understanding, even in the quietest hours of the night.